Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another Spinetinglers book review for you all. And this is actually the final book of the Spinetinglers series. It's book number 30, Saber-Toothed Tiger. Off the bat, this is actually a Tim Jacobus cover, so if you're a Tim Jacobus collector and you want all of his covers, this book is probably going to be the highest ticket commodity you could ever get in your collection because it is the rarest kids horror book in existence from what I have come across in my time of collecting. This book is an absolute nightmare to track down. There's actually less than 5 people I know of online that actually own a copy of this. A person on Instagram and 2 of my good friends, Zoe DeLeon and Monster Blood. And I know Zoe's already read this book and made a review on Goodreads. And me and Monster Blood are actually doing a buddy read for this. Expect a review on his channel whenever he uploads his review of this book. I will put the link of that video into the description and in the comment section of this video for you all to go check it out. But yeah, Saber-Toothed Tiger, the last book of the Spinetinglers series, is infamously hard to find. Now, the Spinetinglers run of books, it's about 30 books exactly. It ran in the mid to, to early late 90s, around 1997, 1998. It was written by various ghost writers under the pen name Empty Coffin, which is a play on the term empty coffin. And this one was written by Jim DeFelice, who wrote some other books that I've read and reviewed already on the channel. I think he wrote Camp Crocodile, and he also wrote Lizard People, which I have reviews for. And this is the third Jim DeFelice that I've read. I know he has some other ones. I think he wrote the 29th book as well, if I'm not mistaken, or that could have been Kathleen Dewey. I'm not too sure. But this one here, I think probably is one of his more straightforward books that he wrote for the series. It's not without its issues, though, and honestly, the issues really pile on this book, to the point where I kind of question why it exists. It feels like a quota book. It feels like they really didn't care with this final entry here. It feels like they also kind of knew the series was ending because around this point they stopped putting advertisements for future books or former books in it, and this one has 0 ads inside of it, which is kind of telling that they knew the jig was up with this one. But off the bat, would I recommend you read this thing? Well, since this thing is so rare and it's not on archive and it's going to cost you a lot of money, for the average person out there, you do not need to read this book. And I do not recommend it. I really don't recommend it. It's not really good, but it's not really bad, and I'll get into that in a bit. But unless you're a collector, this is one of those books you should just treat like a trophy book and just never read it. It's not really worth your time. So it's kind of unfortunate, but that seems to be the running gag with all these really expensive books online. Mine is like the Revenge of the Law Gnomes TV book that I've come across, or maybe the Jack-o'-lanterns TV book, that actually are kind of worthwhile to read. So yeah, take that with a grain of salt. But anywho, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. Now, since this is such a rare book, I might go into a little more detail just so you all can get a sense of what the story is about, more than usual. But the main character's name is Alan Evans, and he starts off the story in kind of like a futuristic sense. So the entire story is being told like it happened in past tense, which is kind of a shakeup for these kind of books. He's kind of narrating it like past events and stuff like that, and putting the reader into the events prior to, I guess, where he's going to end up by the end. He updates you with, which I thought was kind of refreshing. And off the bat, you can really notice that Jim's writing here is very straightforward, and it's kind of easy to read. The prose is very nice, even though it's missing a lot of elements in it, like atmosphere, but we'll get into that later. But the story starts off the bat about, Alan telling the reader that he has this extraordinary story about cats, and starts off the story by insinuating that these 3 cats started this whole thing, and he gives some backstory that he's from this town that has about 200 to 300 homes in the subdivision built on this old land that goes back generations to, I guess, Native Americans that used to live in the area, and that's what the area is named after. And he alludes that he has this good luck charm that he carries around that's kind of like the pendant that goes back to his ancestors or his great-grandfather. And he gives some backstory that he has a sister that is named after, I think her name is Dakota, and she's named after a name that belonged to the tribe because his great-grandfather was a Native American himself, or at least tied to it. And he seems to be kind of into history and heritage and all that. He seems like a normal kid. And he notices these 3 cats out in front of his neighbor's yard one day. And he's getting ready to go to school with his sister. And nobody seems to be around once his sister like boards her bus or whatever. And he starts to think that maybe these cats are like talking because nobody else is around. He's like being insulted, like he drops his backpack and looks like a fool, kind of embarrasses himself. And he swears that he hears them say something to the effect of like, you know, this kid's dumb and, oh, we're really hungry, we got to eat somebody. And they may or may not be talking about his neighbor. Now, he kind of files in the back of his mind like something's wrong here, don't really know what's up. And as the story goes along, he thinks, you know, since he's kind of close with his neighbor, his mom wants to, you know, invite her over for dinner. But like right before that dinner would happen, he thinks that he sees some like ghost and he's easily scared and he freezes and tenses up. And this plays throughout the story where he has these moments where he's not brave and he doesn't fight. He just sits there and does nothing. And he thinks that he sees like a green ghost coming from her house when he goes to knock because he lost like, I think, a basketball or something in her yard. And it turns out that it's just her in a in a mask and it's one big fake out. But this is kind of like to set up the events of the story, right? So he's like the last person that sees her before she gets invited over for dinner. But unfortunately, she never makes it because when he's sent over to go find her, he finds that her house has been ransacked. Like the bookshelves are knocked over. There's something out of place and something feels very wrong here. And he thinks that she might have gotten eaten by these cats because he heard them say this thing earlier, or at least he thought. So he goes back to his parents and he's like, something's wrong. And he tells them what he thinks happened, but they're like, yeah, let's go investigate. So his parents and his sister go over to the neighbor's house and they end up calling the police, and the police are looking around and she basically vanished in thin air. And Alan has seemed to convince himself that these cats have to be behind this. And now he's trying to find evidence that this actually happened. And you get a couple more events where he thinks he hears the cats talking. And he finally gets to the point where he's like, I'm going to have to find some evidence of this. I'm going to have to look up everything I can while I'm at school for, you know, cats and maybe the area that we live in to kind of get a sense of what this is about. And he finds a book in his library. It's like this very old book. Pages are kind of falling out of it. And it's written by a person named Alan Evans. And he's like, I didn't write this book. I know I didn't, and, you know, unless somebody has the same name as me. And it's called The Cat People. And he takes the book and he's like, okay, this might be a little strange, but I'm going to have to figure out what this is. Well, he takes the book home to read further on it. And he's having a conversation with his mom. And he's like, hey, look, I found this book called The Cat People. And the author has the same name as me. And the mom pretty much drops a backstory to Alan that his great-grandfather, who was teasing earlier on in the story, was actually the author of the book. And he had a mysterious disappearance like shortly after Alan was born that really upset the family. And she had no idea that the school library had a copy of his book. And she immediately tries to tell him that whatever you read in that book isn't real, it's make-believe. And Alan seems to be further and further convinced that it's real. And he has this, you know, interaction. There's a couple of dream sequences that are kind of random in the story where as soon as he starts to think that he hears these cats talking, he's having like dream visitations with these cats, and it's very weird. but it's not really real and all that. Or he thinks that he hears clawing at his windows. It's kind of tense, but nothing too grand there. But his mom is like essentially trying to tell him that all this stuff is in his head and that it never happened. And maybe he should talk to his father about it so he can get a more clear sense about what happened to his great-grandfather. So Alan's like, okay, well, I'm onto these cats. My parents probably aren't going to believe me, but he eventually has a conversation with his father who kind of reinforces what his mom said, but went further and said that his grandfather, or Alan's great-grandfather, kind of went loony a little bit before he disappeared, and he swore that this cat people stuff that he wrote in his book exists. And maybe I should go ahead and tell you what the cat people stuff is. It's essentially an urban legend of sorts that he kind of gathered in his book, and it's talking about essentially this tribe that was kind of, you know, under the radar and was never really talked about in like mainstream history. And they had a legend tied to them that goes back eons, where some of the earliest tribe members, they found this like puma or injured lion and nursed it back to health, but the lion was supernatural. And the lion kind of granted them, like it was like Avatar: The Last Airbender, powers to be able to harness the powers of cats, essentially. And there's a war going on between good cats and evil cats in the spirit realm. Yeah, I'm not making this up. And they literally have an avatar where the pendant gets passed down. Basically, they have a living representation of the tribe, and they get to wear this pendant, and as long as it gets worn around their neck, they can get chosen, and they can manifest their own cat beast that they think that's inside of them. And once they die in the physical realm, the pendant gets passed down so-and-so. And a lot of this is also cleared up. There's a side plot where when his neighbor disappeared, she was also a historian, and she collected a lot of records, and she was actually bequeathed a lot of Alan's great-grandfather's manuscripts that could kind of pair well with the book, because Alan's like, well, now I'm going to use this to write a book report. So he asks his mom if it's cool if he goes over to the neighbor's house who's still missing to grab those papers. And when he does so, he finally sees an image of his grandfather, and there's some other information behind the scenes. And he finally learns what he needs to do with this good luck charm that he's been passed down. He realizes that this same emblem is this heirloom that he's received. So he turns it into a pendant, puts it around his neck. And shortly after, he's visited by a spirit puma. And this spirit puma essentially coaches him on how to manifest his cat form. And he chooses a saber-toothed tiger because on all these dream sequences, he keeps envisioning a saber-toothed tiger, right? So he morphs into a saber-toothed tiger, and he's basically told by the puma that his great-grandfather disappeared because he ascended into the spirit world of the cat people and became like the king of the cats and all that. It's very weird. And eventually they'll get to meet. But essentially these three cats early on in the story that he thought he heard talking are actually a part of the evil ones. And they're going to have to put a stop to them, because there's a whole mechanism that if the evil cats are roaming, it's because they once were human, but when they turn into cats using the pendant, they chose to eat meat while in their cat form. So now, when they're in their natural form, they're like house cats, but if they imagine that they want to be bigger beasts, they can form into like mountain lions or jaguars or whatever cat they picked. And they have abilities to fly. It's very morbid and kind of all over the place. But the evil ones have more power. And this puma figure tells him, like, you need to resist. You know, the good, they don't have as much power as the evil. But trust me, you don't want to be associated with the evil. The good is the righteous way. So Alan is like taking all this in. And him and his puma friend actually get in a scuffle in their cat forms with these three cats from the earlier, and you get to learn their names. One of them's named Stinky. I think another one's named Slim or something. I forget. But the main ringleader is Stinky. And Alan actually messes up the leader, and they kind of retreat. So Alan's made a point, and he realizes that he's very tired after fighting with his friend, so he decides to go up to his room and go to bed. And when he wakes up the next day, as he was sleeping, his body naturally reverted back to his human form, and he now has a more ravenous appetite and all that. And he goes to school, and he's taking notes on things that he has to do, and he kind of daydreams and nods off in class. But when he comes home from school, he sees that his sister's in trouble. These three cats have come back to corner his sister, and there's a thing where the cats have like accelerated healing factors and all that, and he basically has to morph into a saber-toothed tiger in front of his own sister using the pendant to save his sister from harm. And in doing so, he has a very close call with death and manages to potentially kill. It gets kind of dark, but potentially kill one or two of these cat figures as they scurry off from the rest of the plot of the story. And the ending, I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but it's kind of harrowing because it's one of those dark and depressing ones where the main character kind of loses, but not really. He ends up being forced to do something he didn't want to do just to survive. But there is a touching moment where he gets reunited with his great-grandfather in like a spirit form and all that, and you get to see what becomes of that. And Alan kind of gives like a copacetic ending where it's not ideal, but he's cool with it, and he's taken on a new identity, and he's got a new life and all that, and that's essentially where the book leaves off. And that's what you're going to expect at a saber-toothed tiger. Off the bat, the first thing I can say is this kind of feels like an Animorphs book. And if you're a fan of Animorphs, you might like this, honestly. Compared to Lizard People or Pet Store, or I think there's some, like one or two other Spinetinglers books in the series that feature main characters going through weird situations where they start behaving like animals or actually turning into animals. This one feels kind of like an Animorphs type of plot. You got some supernatural science fiction going on. A kid can like choose like a spirit cat and turn into it. The concept is kind of neat, and while it's kind of misplaced here in a kids horror series, because honestly this is not kids horror, it was a fun little, adventure fantasy book, and it was kind of neat. Some of the backstory does get into some iffy territory, dealing with like Native American culture and all that, but I don't think it went too far with it. And the main character seemed to be part Native American, which was kind of refreshing. And I actually really dig the parts of the back half of the story where it gets into, honoring your, it has like thematic messages of honoring what came before you and choosing the righteous path. All of these similar ideas have been used in iconic shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender. And in a lot of ways, this kind of feels like those old late 90s, early 2000s to mid 2000s adventure cartoons. This sounds like a setup to a cartoon that would have been in that time period. And I'm kind of surprised that it wasn't turned into a cartoon, because it has a pretty decent setup to it, and it has like that Animorphs vibe that I think is cool. If I was a kid, I would have thought this was a cool idea. Alan's monologue is pretty rich in its prowess. He's very detailed, and like I said, I really like how the book structures itself, starting in like past tense events and working up to the present. And some parts of the build were rather nice. However, that's where my compliments kind of end with this book, and I'm starting to get into negatives now, and these are pretty heavy-hitting ones. I want to be upfront, man. The first 45 pages of this book is kind of random feeling, because there's no exposition to any of this. You're pretty much thrown into the situation where you have a kid that thinks cats are talking, and then it goes into "you gotta believe me." It goes right into that. And if you know me, if you know my channel, one of my biggest bugaboos in Goosebumps or in kids horror are "you gotta believe me" kids, where they just constantly say, "Hey, you gotta believe me, this stuff is happening," and they do nothing to change it. And this character does literally nothing for like half the book to help anything. He's just saying, oh, the cats are talking to me. And I'm like, okay, do something about it. And it takes till around page 55 to 60 for this kid to start doing anything about it. And this book is only 124 pages. It's not as egregious as some others, but that really got in the way. I think the first half of the book as a whole is kind of rough because you don't really know where the story's going. And in a lot of ways, this bleeds into my second negative. The second half of the book, the whole Animorphs-like plot, feels like a tangent to what the first half was setting up. I was very vague with the ending, but the ending is also another negative to add on here, but it's its own thing here. But the ending not only recontextualizes the first half of the book, what we thought happened to the neighbor, but it makes it kind of pointless. And I hate all-for-nothing books, and while the second half, in terms of what that story was doing, was more satisfying with the ending, the first half felt like a complete waste of time and just page filler. Honestly, this could have been trimmed down to maybe 80 pages, and it could have been like a short novella. This did not need to be a 124-page novel. The first half and the second half really don't add up. The whole mystery about what happened to the neighbor is played up heavily in the first half. That gets dropped by the second half when it becomes, oh, let's become, Aang from Avatar or Korra from Legend of Korra, but like give them like an Animorphs power. It's ridiculous. And to throw more salt on the wound, this book has really no atmosphere. You would think that if you're going to have a book set in like, a former Native American grounds and they have a neighborhood, maybe build more onto the atmosphere of that, go into a more spiritual route, have the kids be in the forest more, or they find a cave with cave paintings on it or something. At least go that route. But this book had like zero atmosphere. It was super stale. Honestly, this has one of the most stale atmospheres I've read in a kid's horror book in a long time. The town, you're given a town name, but there's no time of year described. There's none of that. I mean, it's just super vague, super generic. And that really deflated, like, just the mood of the story when I'm taking it in. It just felt like we're being told something without being shown something. And that's the point of writing where I think that R.L. Stine most of the time succeeds in over other kids' horror writers, is that R.L. Stine's able to show you what's going on with his writing. Jim DeFelice here is just telling you. And that is really depressing. And, one last thing, one last jab to throw at this book. This is not a kid's horror book. This is not a kid's horror book. Yes, there is some fight scenes that get kind of bloody, and there's some implications in the mystery part before it's recontextualized in the end that maybe somebody got killed, but that never actually happened. This is more of an adventure book. This could have been a standalone Avon Camelot book, the publisher of this series, Avon Camelot. This could have been like a little standalone adventure book. This did not need to be thrown in here. And honestly feels like they threw this in here because they needed a book just to have in the series. And maybe Jim wrote this one and he was like, all right, we'll just throw it into Spinetinglers. And it ended up being the last book of the series. And for this being the last book of the series, for it being that underwhelming, it also kind of has that Monster Blood 4 effect. Where, because it's the last one, you're like, wow, well, it could have been worse, but it could have been better. So all in all, from a 0 to 5 star basis, honestly, y'all, all those problems I mentioned really added up. These were like 0.3 to 0.4s a piece. And it tanked it down below a C tier, which is a 3.5 for me. Honestly, I dig the fact that it has some Animorphs elements. And honestly, I have more positives with this than most of this category. And it might, fare well on my memory when I eventually do a series ranking of these Spinetinglers books. I might bump this up in the future. But because of just how flat the writing was, and because of how insultingly pointless the first half of this book was, and on top of it having "you gotta believe me" tropes in it, and just really serving nothing to what the story was actually talking about in the second half, that sunk it down further and it left a bad taste in my mouth. It felt kind of sloppy, but more of an organized sloppy, if that makes any sense. So I got below a 3.5. I settled on a D tier though, so I'm going to give it between a 3 to a 3.4. And where I settled on this, because of that insultingness it kind of packs a punch with, and for the fact that it's the final Spinetinglers book, being as meh as it was, I decided to give this book a 3.1 out of 5 stars. It's not good, not bad, more meh. I've read worse in the series. I think there are more redeeming factors. Like I said, if I think on this one more, it might get bumped up to a higher D tier, but I don't think I can ever bump this up to a C. Like I said, if you're a fan of the Animorph series, this kind of has that vibe. If you're a fan of Why I'm Afraid of Bees, or Alone in Snakebite Canyon, or other kids' horror books, or something associated that has like kids turning into animals as part of the plot in like some weird way, this might be up your alley. If not, don't waste your time. This is a very rare book. It's not on archive. It's super hard to come across. If you find it out in the wild, buy it and read it if you like, but treat it like a trophy book if you had it. You don't need to read it. And that's all I have to say about it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Saber-Toothed Tiger. Let me know down in the comment section if you actually have read this book, because it's so hard to find. Let me know. Did you like it? Did you not? Did you love it? Did you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.